Section 1. The sound of a baby's soft cries filled the dimly lit nursery, pulling Elena Carter from her exhausted daze. She had barely closed her eyes, yet little Noah, the 6-month-old she had been hired to babysit, was already stirring. With a deep breath, she pushed herself up from the chair and walked toward the crib, her movements gentle as she reached for the tiny bundle. There, sweetheart," she murmured, cradling the baby in her arms. "I've got you." She had only been working as a nanny for 2 weeks, and already the late nights were taking a toll on her, but she couldn't complain. The pay was too good, and more than that, she needed this job, desperately. Elena adjusted Noah against her chest, gently rocking him back and forth, humming a soft lullaby as she walked across the spacious nursery. The room itself was bigger than her entire apartment, decorated in soft blues and creams, the walls lined with shelves full of expensive toys and custom-made furniture. The sheer luxury of it still took her breath away. Then again, everything about this house did. Elena had heard stories about Alexander Wolf before she even started working for him. The billionaire CEO of Wolf Industries, known for his ruthless business deals and even colder demeanor, was one of the most powerful men in the country. People spoke of him with both admiration and fear, as though he were a god among men. She had expected to meet an arrogant, detached man who barely acknowledged his son. Instead, she had been surprised. Alexander Wolf was different. Oh, he was cold, yes, distant, but he was always present for Noah. He would come home late at night and go straight to the nursery, watching his son sleep for long minutes before heading to his own room. There were mornings when he would personally feed Noah before leaving for work, and even though he barely spoke to Elena beyond the necessary instructions, she had seen something in his eyes whenever he looked at his child, something vulnerable. Still, that didn't mean she wasn't intimidated by him. Alexander was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. With sharp, chiseled features, piercing gray eyes, and a physique that exuded strength, he was the kind of person people both respected and feared. And Elena? She was just the babysitter, just a struggling college dropout trying to make ends meet. Noah's cries had settled into quiet sniffles by the time she laid him back in his crib, carefully tucking him in before stepping back. She checked the baby monitor, making sure it was still connected, then sighed softly. It was nearly 2 a.m. She should go back to her room. But as she turned to leave, the nursery door creaked open, and her breath caught in her throat. Alexander Wolf stood in the doorway, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the top buttons undone, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked as though he had just come from a business meeting. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his sharp gaze scanning the room before settling on her. "Elena," he said, his voice deep and smooth. She swallowed. "Mr. Wolf." His eyes flickered toward Noah's crib, lingering for a moment before he looked back at her. "He's asleep?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, he woke up a little while ago, but I rocked him back to sleep." Alexander said nothing, simply staring at her. The silence stretched between them, thick with something she couldn't name. She had never been alone with him like this, not in the middle of the night, not with the house so eerily quiet. And for some reason her pulse raced. She dropped her gaze, clearing her throat. "I was just heading back to my room." "Wait." The single word stopped her in her tracks. She looked up, confused, as Alexander stepped further into the room, his presence almost suffocating. There was something different about him tonight, something intense. His usual unreadable mask had cracked just enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath. "Elena," he said again, softer this time, "have you ever thought about quitting?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked. "Quitting?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This job, watching my son every night, dealing with—" He paused, his jaw clenching. "Everything." Elena hesitated. She didn't know what had brought this on, but for the first time, Alexander Wolf didn't look like an untouchable CEO. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and she found herself answering honestly. "No," she murmured. "I haven't thought about quitting." His gaze sharpened. "Why?" "Because I need the money, because I don't have anywhere else to go, because despite everything, I like being here." She didn't say any of those things. Instead, she shrugged. "I just haven't," she said simply. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Good." And with that, he turned and left the room. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart was still pounding. She didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. Something had changed, and she had a feeling nothing would ever be the same again. Hours later, Elena woke up in a bed that wasn't hers. Warmth surrounded her, the scent of crisp cologne and expensive sheets filling her senses. Her body felt heavy, her mind foggy as she slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the morning sunlight streaming through the curtains. And then, she froze. Her breath hitched as she realized she wasn't in her small nanny's quarters. She was in Alexander Wolf's bed, and he was right there beside her. Elena's stomach dropped. This wasn't possible. How had she? Her mind raced as she slowly sat up, clutching the blanket against her chest. She was still in her nightshirt and leggings, but that didn't make her panic any less. What was she doing here? What had happened last night? Her memories were hazy, but she remembered rocking Noah to sleep, Alexander showing up in the nursery, and then everything else was a blur. Elena's hands trembled as she turned her head, looking at the man beside her. Alexander was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen before. His usually sharp features were softer in the morning light, his dark lashes resting against his cheekbones. He looked different, less like the intimidating billionaire and more like a man who had let down his guard, even if just for a moment. Elena swallowed hard. She needed to get out of here. Carefully, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, trying not to make a sound as she slid off the mattress. Her heart pounded as she tiptoed toward the door, her breath held tightly in her chest. Almost there. But just as her fingers touched the doorknob, a deep voice rumbled behind her. Elena. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. Alexander was awake now, his silver-gray eyes locking onto hers. He looked at her, then at the bed, his expression darkening. And then, with a voice filled with quiet intensity, he asked the one question that sent her entire world spinning. What the hell are you doing in my bed? Section 2. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen at the bedroom door, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could feel the weight of Alexander Wolf's gaze piercing through her, pinning her in place. I don't know, she stammered, barely able to form the words. Her mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. How had she ended up in his bed? She had been in the nursery putting Noah to sleep, and then nothing. Her memory was a blur, like a fog had settled over the night before. Alexander sat up, running a hand through his tousled, dark hair, his silver-gray eyes sharp and filled with something she couldn't decipher. His white dress shirt was slightly unbuttoned, revealing a glimpse of his defined chest, and for a brief moment, Elena found herself distracted by how effortlessly handsome he looked, even first thing in the morning, but she quickly snapped out of it. This was not the time to be thinking about that. Explain, Alexander said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet authority that sent shivers down her spine. How did you end up here? Elena swallowed hard. I don't remember, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw clenched. Elena could see the way his mind was working, how he was analyzing every possible scenario. He was a businessman after all, a man who always calculated his next move, who never let himself be caught off guard. But this was something even he hadn't anticipated. Did you come here on your own? He asked, his tone sharp. No, she blurted out, shaking her head. I would never. She trailed off, suddenly unsure. Would she? Had she somehow wandered into his room by mistake? No, that didn't make sense. Even if she had been half asleep, she knew her own room was down the hall, past the staircase. There was no way she would have ended up here without realizing it. Then how? Elena. The way he said her name made her breath catch. He wasn't just asking for an answer. He was demanding one, but she didn't have one to give. I swear, Mr. Wolf, I don't know how this happened, she said, her voice pleading. I was in the nursery with Noah, and the next thing I knew, I woke up here. Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, without a word, he threw off the blanket and stood up. Elena quickly turned away, her face flushing as she realized he was only wearing his dress pants from the night before, the crisp fabric sitting low on his hips. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, embarrassment twisting in her stomach. This was bad, really, really bad. She needed to get out of here before this became even more of a disaster. I should go, she mumbled, reaching for the doorknob again. But before she could turn it, Alexander's voice stopped her. Elena. She hesitated. I don't believe in coincidences, he said slowly. If you ended up in my bed, there's a reason for it. She turned around, her brows furrowing. You think I did this on purpose? I don't know, he admitted, his voice carefully neutral. But I intend to find out. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as if he were waiting for her to crack under the weight of it. But Elena refused to back down. I would never do something like this, she said firmly. I have no reason to. Don't you? The question sent a chill through her. What is that supposed to mean? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Alexander took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. You needed this job, he said. You told me yourself. I don't doubt your capabilities as a nanny, but if you had another motive for working here, she gasped, cutting him off. You think I planned this? That I somehow manipulated my way into your bed to what? Seduce you? Trap you? His silence was enough of an answer. Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. I can't believe this, she muttered, shaking her head. I knew you were cold, but I didn't think you were paranoid. Alexander's eyes darkened. Be careful what you say, Elena. Or what? She shot back. You'll fire me. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Because the truth was, he could. With one snap of his fingers, she would be out of a job, out of a home, and back to struggling just to put food on the table. And the worst part? He knew it. Alexander didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled. No, he said. I'm not going to fire you. Elena blinked, caught off guard. You're not? His gaze was intense. Not until I know exactly what happened last night. Her breath hitched. This was far from over. Later that morning, Elena found herself sitting in the grand dining room, poking at a plate of untouched food. The atmosphere was tense, charged with something unspoken. Alexander sat at the head of the long table, dressed in a crisp suit, looking every bit the billionaire CEO he was. But there was something different about him this morning, something more rigid, more controlled, as if he were trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, as if last night hadn't happened, but it had, and Elena still didn't know how or why. You should eat, Alexander said, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled. I'm not hungry. His jaw tightened. Starving yourself won't change anything. Elena sighed, setting her fork down. I'm not starving myself. I'm just not in the mood. A muscle in his jaw ticked, but he didn't push her. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, regarding her with that unreadable gaze of his. If something like this happens again, he said, his voice dangerously low, I expect you to tell me immediately. She frowned. Something like what? He arched an eyebrow. You waking up in my bed? Heat rushed to her face. That's not going to happen again. His lips curled into a slow, almost amused smirk. Good. Elena exhaled sharply. This man was impossible. But as she sat there watching him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. That whatever had happened last night was just the beginning. Section 3. Elena spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to push aside the morning's disaster. She had thrown herself into her work, keeping herself busy with Noah, preparing his meals, playing with him in the garden, and making sure he was content. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, one thought kept echoing in her mind. How did she end up in Alexander Wolf's bed? She had been in the nursery last night. That much she remembered clearly. She had been sitting beside Noah's crib, watching over him as he slept, humming a lullaby to calm herself as much as to soothe him. She had been exhausted after a long day, her body weighed down by fatigue. Had she dozed off? That was the only explanation that made sense. But how could she have sleepwalked to another room, a room that was not even near the nursery, and climbed into his bed without waking up? It made no sense. Even worse, Alexander suspected her. His words still rang in her ears. If you had another motive for working here. The accusation had stung more than it should have. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to be professional, to show him that she was capable of taking care of Noah without any ulterior motives. But none of that mattered now. In his eyes, she was a suspect. By dinner, the tension between them hadn't faded. Alexander barely spoke to her throughout the meal, and when he did, his words were clipped, his tone unreadable. Noah, however, was as cheerful as ever, babbling away happily as he played with his food, completely oblivious to the thick atmosphere between the adults. Elena focused on Noah, determined to ignore the unsettling weight of Alexander's presence across the table. Do you want more carrots, sweetheart? She asked gently, cutting another small piece for him. Noah clapped his hands. More! She smiled, glad for the distraction, and placed a few more on his plate. Alexander watched them silently, his sharp silver eyes lingering on her longer than necessary. She could feel it. Every time she looked up, she caught him studying her, as if he was still trying to piece together the events of last night. Finally, he broke the silence. Elena, she stilled, looking up cautiously. Yes, we need to talk. Her stomach twisted. Not now, not in front of Noah. She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already pushing back his chair, standing up. In my office, he added, his voice leaving no room for argument. Elena swallowed hard. Finish eating first, baby, she murmured to Noah, forcing a smile before rising to follow Alexander. Her legs felt heavy as she walked down the long hallway, every step taking her closer to whatever confrontation awaited her. She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. Alexander's office was just as imposing as the rest of the mansion. Dark mahogany shelves lined with books, sleek leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The room was eerily quiet as he shut the door behind her, the soft click of the lock sending a chill down her spine. Sit, he ordered. Elena hesitated but obeyed, lowering herself onto one of the plush leather chairs across from his desk. Alexander leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, his gaze cold and calculating. I ran a security check, he said without preamble. Her eyes widened. What? There are cameras in the hallway, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. I checked the footage from last night. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Cameras. That meant he knew how she had ended up in his room. What did you see? She asked, barely above a whisper. Alexander's jaw tightened. You left the nursery just after midnight. She frowned. That didn't sound right. You were walking slowly, he went on, studying her reaction closely. Your eyes were half closed and you seemed disoriented. Elena's heart pounded. Sleepwalking, she murmured. Alexander nodded once. It appears so. Relief flooded through her, brief, fleeting. So he didn't think she had done it on purpose. That was something at least. But then his next words sent her right back into panic. Why didn't you tell me you have a history of sleepwalking? Elena froze. She didn't, at least not that she knew of. I don't, she said firmly. I've never sleepwalked in my life. Alexander's expression darkened. Then why did it happen last night? She shook her head, struggling to find an answer. I don't know. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alexander exhaled sharply and straightened, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to make sense of things himself. Elena, if this is going to be a problem, it won't be. She cut in quickly. I'll make sure of it. She didn't know how, but she would. She couldn't afford to lose this job over something so ridiculous. Alexander studied her for a long moment, then finally sighed. For now, he said, his voice softer but still laced with warning. Just be careful. Elena swallowed hard and nodded. She stood up, eager to get out of there, but as she turned toward the door, Alexander's voice stopped her once more. Elena! She looked back at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. If you ever wake up in my bed again, he said slowly, tell me first before trying to run. Her face flamed. I won't, she snapped, turning on her heel and storming out before he could say another word. That night, Elena double-checked the lock on her bedroom door 3 times before climbing into bed. She wasn't taking any chances. Sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake for what felt like hours, her mind racing. Why had she sleepwalked? Why now? And more importantly, why into his room? Something wasn't right. The logical part of her brain told her it was just stress, exhaustion. She had been working hard, adjusting to this new life, taking care of Noah. Maybe it had finally taken a toll on her body. That had to be it, right? But deep down, something nagged at her, something she couldn't quite shake. As her eyelids grew heavier, a quiet thought drifted through her mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Section 4. The next morning, Elena woke up groggy, but at least she had stayed in her own bed this time. She stretched, rubbing her temples, still shaken from the previous night's conversation with Alexander. Sleepwalking? It was absurd. She had no history of it, no memory of ever wandering around in her sleep before. But the security footage didn't lie. Her gut told her something was off, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had work to do. Slipping into a comfortable yet professional outfit, she quickly made her way to the kitchen, where Noah was already seated in his high chair, happily munching on a piece of toast. "Good morning, sweetheart," she greeted, pressing a kiss to his forehead before glancing around the room. Alexander wasn't there. Good. She wasn't ready to face him just yet. "Did you sleep well?" she asked Noah, ruffling his curls. The little boy giggled and clapped his hands. "Yes, I dreamt about dinosaurs." Elena smiled. "That sounds like fun." She poured herself a cup of coffee, hoping the caffeine would help clear her head. She had barely taken a sip when Mrs. Evans, the housekeeper, entered the room with a slightly anxious expression. "Miss Elena," she said hesitantly. Elena frowned. "Yes?" "Mr. Wolf would like to see you in his office," Mrs. Evans said, her voice gentle but firm. Elena's stomach twisted. So much for avoiding him. She nodded, setting down her cup and giving Noah a quick hug before heading toward Alexander's office. This time, when she stepped inside, she noticed something different. Alexander wasn't sitting behind his desk. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city skyline, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit. He looked deep in thought. "Elena," he said without turning around. She stiffened. "Yes, Mr. Wolf." At the sound of her formal tone, he finally turned to face her. There was something unreadable in his silver eyes. "We need to talk," he said. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. "About what?" He took a slow step toward her, his gaze locked onto hers. "I made some calls this morning," he said. Her pulse spiked. "Calls?" "I spoke to a doctor." Elena's breath caught. "What?" "I needed to understand why you might have sleepwalked," he continued, studying her carefully. "According to the specialist, extreme stress or suppressed trauma can sometimes trigger episodes of sleepwalking, even in people who've never experienced it before." Elena's fingers tightened into fists. Trauma. She didn't like that word. She didn't want to think about what it could mean. "I don't have any trauma," she said quickly. "I'm fine." Alexander arched a brow. "Are you?" She held his gaze, refusing to let him see the crack in her armor. "I don't know why it happened, but it was a one-time thing," she insisted. "It won't happen again." Alexander didn't look convinced. "Elena, I need to know if you're fit to take care of Noah." Her breath hitched. There it was, the real reason for this conversation. She clenched her jaw, anger sparking in her chest. "I would never do anything to put Noah in danger," she said, her voice cold. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Then prove it," he said. Elena's heart pounded. "How?" "I want you to stay in the main house," he said simply. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You'll move out of the guest house and into a room closer to Noah's," he explained. "That way, if anything happens, I'll be able to make sure you're safe." Her jaw dropped. You want me to live in the mansion?" "Yes." "No." Alexander's brows lifted slightly. "No? I don't need to be supervised," she snapped. "I can handle myself just fine." His gaze darkened. "This isn't about you, Elena, it's about Noah." Her frustration only grew. "I understand your concern," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "But I don't need you hovering over me like I'm some kind of liability." Alexander's jaw ticked. "I don't hover," she scoffed. "That's exactly what you're doing right now." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Elena," he said, his voice quieter now. "Just trust me on this." She hesitated. Trust, that was a dangerous word, but for Noah's sake, she had no choice. "Fine," she muttered. Alexander gave a small nod. "Good." Later that evening, Elena packed up her things and moved into one of the guest rooms in the main house. The room was beautiful, spacious, elegant, with a stunning view of the garden, but she felt caged. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had come here to be Noah's nanny, not to be under Alexander Wolf's constant scrutiny. Still, she forced herself to push aside her frustration. If this was what it took to prove she could handle the job, then so be it. After settling in, she headed downstairs to check on Noah. She found him in the playroom, happily stacking blocks while Alexander sat nearby, watching him. The sight made her pause. Alexander Wolf, the cold, ruthless billionaire, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his son. It was a rare sight. Something about it made her chest tighten. "You're good with him," she said before she could stop herself. Alexander glanced up, surprised by her words. His gaze softened just a fraction. "I try," he murmured. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Something unspoken. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment was gone. "Elena," he said, his voice back to its usual guarded tone. She straightened. "Yes? I want to take Noah to the beach tomorrow," he said. "Come with us." She frowned. "What?" "I think it'll be good for him," Alexander continued. "And for you." Elena hesitated. This felt too personal. But Noah's excited voice cut through her doubts. "Beach, beach." He was practically bouncing now, clapping his hands. Elena sighed. She couldn't say no to that face. "All right," she relented. "We'll go." Alexander nodded, satisfied. Good. The next morning, they drove to a private beach. The sky was clear, the waves gentle, the sand soft beneath their feet. Noah was beyond thrilled, running around with his tiny bucket and shovel, giggling as the ocean lapped at his feet. Elena found herself relaxing for the first time in days. She knelt in the sand, helping Noah build a castle, laughing when he demanded that she make it bigger. "You're too slow," Noah teased, grinning up at her. She gasped in mock offense. "Excuse me? I'm an expert sandcastle builder." Noah giggled, but then suddenly a shadow fell over them. Elena looked up straight into Alexander's piercing silver eyes. He was standing close, too close. Her breath caught. "Mind if I help?" he asked. She swallowed. Noah clapped his hands. "Yes, Daddy, help." Alexander smirked. "You heard the boss." And just like that, he knelt beside them, rolling up his sleeves, his hands sinking into the sand. For the first time, they weren't arguing. For the first time, it felt easy, natural. Elena didn't know what it meant. She only knew one thing. She was in trouble. Section 5. The beach trip had changed something. Elena felt it the moment they returned to the house. There was a new kind of awareness between her and Alexander. Something unspoken, something dangerous, and she hated it. Because the last thing she needed was to be caught up in the web of a man like Alexander Wolf. She wasn't like the women in his world. She didn't belong in expensive mansions, surrounded by power and wealth. She was just a babysitter, and she needed to remember that. That night, Elena tossed and turned in bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept replaying the way Alexander had looked at her on the beach, the warmth in his silver eyes, the rare smile that had softened his normally sharp features. It was too much, too confusing. She groaned, rolling onto her side. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. She just needed to focus on her job, on Noah, not on Alexander, never on Alexander. The next morning, Elena was up early making breakfast for Noah. She was determined to shake off whatever strange tension had settled between her and his father. But the moment Alexander walked into the kitchen, she knew it wasn't going to be that easy. He was freshly showered, his dark hair slightly damp, his suit crisp and perfectly tailored, and he looked at her differently now. Not with cold indifference, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, with interest. "Elena," he said smoothly, taking a seat across from her. She stiffened. "Mr. Wolf." His lips twitched. "Back to that, are we?" "I don't know what you mean." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unreadable silver eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, he sighed. "I'm taking Noah to the office today," he said. "I want you to come with us." Elena blinked. "To your office?" "Yes." She hesitated. That was personal territory. More personal than the mansion. "Why?" she asked cautiously. Alexander's gaze darkened slightly. "Because I don't trust anyone else to take care of him." That hit her like a punch to the gut. Because deep down she knew it was a compliment. A sign that, despite everything, he did trust her, even if he would never say it outright. An hour later, Elena found herself walking into Wolf Enterprises, holding Noah's hand tightly. The building was enormous, 50 stories of glass and steel, towering over the city like a monument to Alexander's power. Employees moved quickly through the sleek modern halls, all dressed in sharp suits, all moving with purpose. And the moment Alexander stepped inside, the entire atmosphere shifted. People practically jumped out of his way. "Elena," he murmured as they approached the private elevator. She glanced up at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. "Yes?" His silver eyes met hers. "Stay close." The words sent an unexpected shiver down her spine, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time she realized something terrifying. Alexander Wolf wasn't just a ruthless billionaire. He wasn't just Noah's father. He was dangerous in a completely different way. because if she wasn't careful, she might actually start to like him. The top floor of Wolf Enterprises was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. It was sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. Alexander's office was enormous, dark wood, black leather, and expensive art that probably cost more than her entire salary. She felt out of place the moment she stepped inside. "This is your office?" she asked, glancing around. Alexander smirked. "Disappointed," she huffed. "I was expecting something warmer." His brow arched. "I don't do warm." "No kidding." Noah, on the other hand, loved it. The little boy ran straight to the enormous couch, flopping onto it with a giggle. "Daddy, can I have a snack?" Alexander chuckled. "You just ate breakfast." Noah pouted. "I'm still hungry." Elena hid a smile. "You're going to spoil him," she teased. Alexander's gaze flickered to her. "And you're going to stop me?" She met his eyes evenly. "Someone has to." His smirk widened, and for the first time she realized something else. He liked when she challenged him. An hour later, while Alexander was in a meeting, Elena sat in his office with Noah, keeping him entertained. But then the door suddenly swung open, and a woman walked in, a stunning woman, tall, blonde, perfectly dressed. She looked at Elena like she was something scraped off the bottom of her shoe. "And who are you?" she asked coldly. Elena straightened. "I'm Noah's nanny." The woman's red lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, another one." Elena frowned. "Excuse me?" But before the woman could answer, another voice interrupted. A deep, familiar voice. "Victoria," Alexander said sharply, striding into the room. Elena's stomach twisted. Because she knew that name, Victoria Sterling, Alexander's ex-fiancée, and the way she was looking at Elena. She wasn't just here for a friendly visit. The tension in the room was suffocating. Alexander stood between them now, his expression unreadable. Victoria smirked. "I was in the building for a meeting," she said. "Thought I'd stop by." Alexander's jaw ticked. "You shouldn't have." Victoria's gaze flicked back to Elena. "And this is the new nanny?" There was something cruel in her tone. Elena straightened her spine. "Yes." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "She's pretty." Alexander's expression darkened. "Victoria." Victoria ignored him, tilting her head at Elena. "I hope you're not getting any ideas," she murmured. Elena stiffened. "Ideas?" Victoria's smirk widened. "You know, about your boss." Her stomach turned and she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what Victoria was implying, and what was worse. Alexander didn't correct her. "Elena," he said suddenly. She swallowed hard. "Yes?" He hesitated. Then finally he turned to Victoria. "Leave." Victoria arched a brow. "Excuse me?" "I said leave." Elena barely had time to process what had just happened before Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "Interesting," she murmured. "Very interesting." Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the office. Silence. Elena could barely breathe. She was still reeling from what had just happened when Alexander turned to her, his silver eyes unreadable. "Ignore her," he said simply. But how could she? How could she ignore the way Victoria had looked at her? The way she had spoken? The way she had practically confirmed what Elena had been trying so hard to deny? Alexander Wolf wasn't just her boss, and the way he had just defended her? She wasn't sure what that meant, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. Section 6. Elena didn't know why her heart was racing. Maybe it was the way Victoria had looked at her, like she was nothing more than a temporary distraction. Maybe it was the way Alexander had reacted. So sharp, so defensive, so unlike the cold and detached man he usually was. Or maybe it was the way he was looking at her now, like he was trying to figure something out, something dangerous. After Victoria left, the tension in the room was unbearable. Noah was still playing on the couch, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between the adults. Alexander turned to her, his silver eyes unreadable. "She's my ex-fiancée," he said suddenly. Elena forced herself to nod. "I know." Of course she knew. Everyone knew. Victoria Sterling and Alexander Wolf had been engaged for almost 2 years before their relationship ended in one of the most scandalous breakups in New York's high society. But she had never known why. And now, standing in front of him, she wondered if she should ask. Instead, she took a deep breath. "She doesn't like me," she said simply. Alexander let out a sharp breath like he was trying not to laugh. She doesn't like anyone. Elena crossed her arms, and yet she was engaged to you. For a second, something flickered in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place, and then he sighed. It wasn't about love, he admitted. That made her blink. He hesitated before continuing. It was a business arrangement, he said. Our families wanted it, we didn't. Elena frowned. Then why did you agree? His jaw tightened. Because I thought it didn't matter, he said simply. And for the first time she realized the truth. Alexander Wolf had never believed in love. The next few hours were painfully awkward. Alexander had another meeting, which meant Elena was left alone in his office with Noah. She tried to focus on the little boy, but her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened, to Victoria, to Alexander, to everything that was slowly unraveling between them. She needed to get out of here, fast. By the time they returned to the mansion, Elena was exhausted. She had never been more aware of Alexander in her life. Every glance, every word, every touch. It was getting too much, and she hated it, because she knew deep down there was no future in this. Not for someone like her, and definitely not with someone like him. That night she was sitting on her bed flipping through a book when there was a soft knock at her door. She froze. Noah was already asleep, which meant her heart pounded as she got up and opened the door, and there he was, Alexander, standing in the dimly lit hallway, looking like a man who had too many thoughts in his head and not enough ways to get them out. Elena, he said quietly. She swallowed hard. Mr. Wolf. His lips twitched, but there was no amusement in his eyes. I need to talk to you, he said. She hesitated. She knew letting him in was a mistake, but the way he was looking at her, like she was the only person in the world who could understand him. She stepped aside. The moment he walked in, the air changed. She had never had him in her space before. Her room was small, cozy, warm, completely different from the sleek, expensive mansion surrounding it. And for the first time, she saw Alexander Wolf looking slightly out of place. She cleared her throat. What do you want to talk about? He turned to her, his silver eyes intense. And then he said something that nearly knocked the air out of her lungs. I don't trust myself around you. Silence. Her breath hitched. She wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. What? She whispered. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what this is, he said. Her heart was pounding now. This, she echoed. He looked at her, something raw flickering in his gaze. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She took a step back. This is a bad idea, she murmured. His eyes darkened. I know. And yet he was still here, and she wasn't telling him to leave. That was the problem. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she found her voice. You're my boss, she said softly. I know. This can't happen. His jaw clenched. I know. But he wasn't leaving, and neither was she. Her pulse raced. This was dangerous, but somehow, for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to run. Not from him, not from this, and that terrified her more than anything else. After what felt like an eternity, Alexander finally spoke. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly. She swallowed hard. Then don't. His lips pressed into a thin line. She could see the war in his eyes, the push and pull between logic and emotion. And then, finally, he exhaled sharply. Without another word, he turned and walked out of her room, leaving her standing there, heart pounding, hands trembling, completely, utterly breathless, because she knew this wasn't over, not even close. Section 7. Elena barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with everything Alexander had said. I can't stop thinking about you. The words echoed in her head, making her stomach twist with something dangerous, something she couldn't name, and she hated it, because she knew this wasn't supposed to happen. Not with him, not like this. But no matter how much she tried to push it away, one thing was clear. Everything had changed. The next morning she avoided him. She woke up early, made breakfast for Noah, and kept her distance. She didn't even glance at Alexander when he walked into the dining room. But that didn't mean she wasn't aware of him. She felt his presence before she even saw him. The tension in the air was suffocating, but she forced herself to focus on Noah. Not the way Alexander's silver eyes flickered toward her. Not the way her pulse quickened every time he moved. Not the way her body still remembered the way he had looked at her last night. After breakfast, she took Noah outside to the garden. It was one of the few places where she could breathe. But just as she was about to sit down on the wooden bench near the fountain, she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart clenched. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Elena. His voice was smooth, deep, unreadable. She shut her eyes for a second before forcing herself to look at him. He was standing just a few feet away. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her breath hitch. "We need to talk," he said. She stiffened. "There's nothing to talk about." He exhaled sharply. "Elena." "No." Her voice was firmer this time. She shook her head, gripping the edge of the bench. "This can't happen." His jaw clenched. "Why?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you serious?" she whispered. His silver eyes burned into hers. "Yes." She stared at him, heart pounding. "This isn't real," she said quietly. "You don't even know me." His gaze darkened. "That's not true." "Yes, it is," she snapped. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know my past, my fears, my dreams." His fists clenched. "You think I don't want to?" Silence. Her breath hitched. She wasn't sure what stunned her more, the intensity in his voice or the way her heart reacted to it. But she couldn't let this happen, because if she did, she wouldn't survive it. She turned away. "I need to go inside." "Elena." "Please, Alexander." His entire body stiffened. It was the first time she had ever said his name like that. Software almost pleading. And for a second, something flickered across his face. Something raw. But then he took a step back, and without another word, he walked away, leaving her standing there, heart racing and hands shaking, completely, utterly breathless. For the rest of the day, she avoided him. Again, but this time it wasn't just for her. It was for Noah. Because the last thing she needed was to get attached to a man who would never be hers. That night she was helping Noah brush his teeth when something unexpected happened. "Miss Elena," she smiled softly. "Yeah, buddy?" Noah hesitated for a second before looking up at her. "Do you like my dad?" Her breath caught. She froze, gripping the towel in her hand. "What?" Noah tilted his head. "You always look at him funny." She forced out a chuckle. "That's not true." "Yes, it is," he said seriously. "And he looks at you funny too." Her chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. But before she could respond, Noah grinned. "It's okay if you do," he said. "I think you're pretty." She let out a soft breath. And then she knelt down in front of him, gently brushing his messy brown curls away from his face. "You're a sweet boy, Noah," she said softly. "And I love spending time with you." He giggled, but then his smile faded. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. Her heart cracked and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I don't know," she admitted. His lips trembled. "I don't want you to go." Her throat tightened, because she didn't want to go either, but she knew eventually she would have to. She just didn't know when. Later that night, she was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when her phone vibrated on the nightstand. A text from Alexander. She hesitated before picking it up, but when she read the message, her heart nearly stopped. "We need to talk now." She found him in his office. He was sitting behind his desk, but the moment she stepped inside, he stood up. And just like that, she knew. This wasn't about work. This was something else, something bigger, something dangerous. "Elena," he said quietly. She swallowed hard. "What's wrong?" His jaw tightened. Then he walked over to the small bar in the corner of the room and poured himself a drink. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he turned back to her. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "I did something today." Her stomach twisted. "What?" she whispered. His silver eyes locked onto hers. "I looked into your past." The air left her lungs. She stared at him, frozen. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. His gaze was unreadable. "You're not just some babysitter," he said quietly. Her breath hitched, her pulse pounded, because she knew. Everything was about to change, forever. Section 8. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded violently, her pulse hammering so loudly she thought he could hear it. He knew. Somehow, someway, Alexander had looked into her past, and now the fragile walls she had built were about to come crashing down. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her face unreadable, but his silver eyes bore into her, piercing through every layer of protection she had. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. His jaw tightened. He took another sip of his drink. his fingers gripping the glass a little too tightly. "I looked into you, Elena," he said, his voice lower now, "and I found things you didn't tell me." Elena's stomach twisted. She had always known this day would come. She had tried so hard to keep her past buried, to keep her secrets locked away. But Alexander wasn't the kind of man who let things go. And now he was standing in front of her, demanding the truth. Her throat tightened. She had to be careful. "How deep did you look?" she asked quietly. His eyes darkened. "Deep enough." Silence stretched between them. The tension was thick, suffocating. He set his drink down on the table with a quiet thud, stepping closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "There's no record of your last job before you started here," he said. "No clear history before that. Almost like you didn't exist for a few years." Elena stayed perfectly still. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she refused to let any emotion show. She had been so careful, but Alexander was relentless. And now he was waiting for her to explain herself. She swallowed hard. "I told you I moved around a lot," she said. "I took small jobs, worked under the table, nothing official." His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite place. Doubt, curiosity, maybe even concern. "Why?" he asked simply. She exhaled slowly. "Because I was running, because I had no choice. Because if they found me, I wouldn't be standing here right now." She met his gaze head on. "Does it matter?" His jaw tensed. "Elena." Her chest tightened. "I'm not a criminal," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Then, to her surprise, he let out a slow breath. "I know." Her lips parted slightly. "You do?" He nodded. "If you were running from something dangerous, I would have found it." Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or terrified. But then he took another step closer. This time she didn't move. "Elena," he said, his voice softer now. "Whatever you're hiding, it doesn't change what I feel." Her breath hitched. The air between them crackled thick with something neither of them could name. "What I feel." Her heart pounded harder. This wasn't happening, and she couldn't let it happen. But when he reached out, when his fingers brushed against her arm, something inside her cracked. She had spent so long fighting this, pushing him away, convincing herself that she was nothing more than the babysitter. But now she wasn't sure if she could keep running. "Alexander," she whispered. He stepped even closer until there was barely any space between them. She could feel his warmth, his presence, the weight of his gaze. She wanted to move, and she needed to move, but she couldn't. And then the door swung open. They both turned, and standing there, wide-eyed, was Noah. "Dad?" Elena's stomach dropped. Alexander's expression shifted in an instant, and just like that, the moment was gone. Noah blinked at them, clearly confused. "What's going on?" he asked. Alexander exhaled, stepping back. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Did you need something?" Noah hesitated, then nodded. "I had a bad dream," he mumbled. Elena's chest ached. She forced herself to push everything aside. Nothing else mattered except the little boy standing in front of them. She knelt down, offering him a soft smile. "Do you want me to sit with you for a little while?" she asked gently. Noah nodded, rubbing his eyes. Without another word, she took his hand and led him out of the office. But as she walked past Alexander, she didn't dare look at him, because if she did, she knew she would never be able to walk away. That night, she sat beside Noah's bed, gently running her fingers through his hair as he drifted back to sleep. But her thoughts were anything but calm. Everything was spiraling out of control, and if she wasn't careful, she was going to lose herself in something she could never escape. She had to leave, soon, before it was too late. The next morning, she made a decision. She was going to tell Alexander she was quitting. She didn't belong here. And the longer she stayed, the more dangerous this became. Not just for her, but for her heart. But when she walked into the kitchen to tell him, he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him, a smug smirk on her lips, was a woman Elena had never seen before. She was beautiful, cold, poised, and the way she looked at Alexander made Elena's stomach twist. Then the woman turned toward her and smirked. "Oh," she said, her tone dripping with amusement. "You must be the nanny." Elena stiffened. Alexander's expression darkened instantly. "Victoria," he said sharply, "that's enough." The woman, Victoria, arched a brow. "I was just saying hello." Elena clenched her fists. She didn't know why, but she suddenly had the urge to walk out of the room, to get as far away from this as possible, because it didn't matter what had happened between her and Alexander last night. This moment, this woman, was a reminder of who he really was and who she wasn't. She wasn't his equal. She wasn't part of his world. She was the nanny and nothing more. She swallowed hard. "I should go check on Noah," she muttered. Then, before she could stop herself, she turned and left, but not before she heard Victoria laugh softly, and not before she heard Alexander curse under his breath. Her heart clenched. She had to leave because if she stayed any longer, she wasn't sure if she would ever be able to walk away. Section 9. Elena gripped the edges of the bathroom sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with emotions she couldn't control. Last night had been a mistake, a terrible, dangerous mistake. She had let herself believe for just a moment that Alexander saw her as something more than just the babysitter, that the connection between them was real. But then Victoria had appeared, and she had been reminded painfully that she didn't belong in his world. She was nothing more than an employee, and she was a fool for thinking otherwise. Her fingers tightened around the cool porcelain, her heart pounding. She had to leave, she had to quit. Today. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to calm down. This wasn't just about her feelings. This was about survival. She had come here to escape, to find a safe place where she could start over. Falling for Alexander had never been part of the plan. And now, if she wasn't careful, she was going to lose everything. She waited until the afternoon before approaching Alexander's office. Noah was in his playroom, distracted by his favorite puzzles, and Victoria had finally left after spending the entire morning following Alexander around like she owned the place. Elena had barely been able to stand it, but it didn't matter, because by tomorrow she would be gone. She knocked lightly on the door, her heart pounding. "Come in." Alexander's voice was deep, unreadable. Elena pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was standing near the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets. She hesitated. Then she swallowed hard. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. There was a pause, then slowly he turned around. His silver eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, gripping her hands together to keep them from shaking. "I'm quitting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The air in the room seemed to shift instantly. His expression darkened. "What?" She lifted her chin, forcing herself to be strong. "I'm quitting," she repeated. "I'll leave by tomorrow." His jaw clenched. "Elena, I've made up my mind," she said quickly, not giving him a chance to argue. "It's for the best." His hands tightened into fists at his sides. "The best for who?" She hesitated. "For Noah," she said finally. His eyes flashed. "Don't lie to me." She took a step back, her pulse racing. I'm not lying." "Yes, you are," he growled, stepping forward. She inhaled sharply, her entire body going rigid. His presence was overwhelming, his gaze intense, but she refused to back down. "This isn't my place," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't belong here." His jaw tightened. "Is that what you think?" She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I know it." Silence stretched between them, tense, heavy. Then, his fingers suddenly brushed against her chin, tilting her face up. Her breath caught in her throat. "Elena," he murmured, his voice softer now. She swallowed hard. His touch was gentle, but there was something desperate in the way he held her. Something raw, something real. "Don't do this," he said quietly. She closed her eyes, willing herself to be strong. "I have to." His grip tightened slightly. "Why?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Because I can't stay here and pretend that nothing's happening," she whispered. "I can't keep lying to myself." His expression flickered. "Elena, I see the way you look at me," she said, her voice breaking. "And I feel it too." His entire body tensed. "But you belong to a world I don't," she continued, her eyes shining with emotion. "And I won't let myself be your mistake." His breath hitched. "Elena," he murmured, his voice strained. She shook her head. "This has to end." She pulled away, and this time he let her go. She turned around quickly, her chest aching, her legs weak. But before she could reach the door, "Elena!" His voice was firm. She stopped. For a moment, she didn't turn around. Then, he said the last thing she ever expected. "Noah loves you." Her heart shattered. Slowly, she turned. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with something she couldn't name. "He needs you," Alexander said, his voice raw. She swallowed hard. "He has you." His jaw clenched. "He needs you too." Her throat tightened. She had spent so much time convincing herself that leaving was the right choice. But what about Noah? Would leaving hurt him more than staying ever could? She exhaled shakily. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. He took a step closer. "I do," he said softly. Her lips parted, and then the door suddenly burst open. Both of them turned, and standing there, wide-eyed and breathless, was Noah. "Dad!" Alexander's face hardened instantly. "What is it?" Noah's eyes were wide with fear. "There's a man outside," he said quickly. "He was asking for Elena." Elena's blood ran cold. Her entire body froze. No, this couldn't be happening, and not now, not here. She felt Alexander stiffen beside her. Then his voice was sharp. "What man?" Noah looked at her, his little face pale. "He said he knew you." Her stomach dropped. Her hands trembled. She forced herself to breathe. She had to stay calm. She had to think. But before she could say anything, Alexander was already moving. He grabbed his phone, his entire body rigid with tension. "Stay here," he ordered. Then, before she could argue, he strode out of the room. Elena stood there, her heart pounding, her legs weak. This was it. Her past had finally caught up to her, and this time, there was nowhere left to run. Section 10. Elena's heart pounded as she rushed after Alexander, fear clawing at her chest. She had spent years trying to bury her past, to keep the darkness away. But now, it had found her. Noah's words echoed in her mind. "There's a man outside. He was asking for Elena." She knew exactly who it was, and she knew what he wanted. Panic tightened in her throat as she stepped into the grand hallway, her legs trembling beneath her. She spotted Alexander ahead of her, his powerful frame rigid with tension as he stormed toward the front entrance. His bodyguards flanked him, their expressions sharp and alert. Elena had seconds to stop him. "Alexander, wait!" she called, her voice urgent. But he didn't stop. He threw open the massive front doors, stepping outside into the crisp night air. And there, standing at the foot of the marble steps, was the last person Elena ever wanted to see. Liam, her ex. The man she had spent years running from. He hadn't changed. Same cruel smirk. Same piercing eyes that held no warmth. Same aura of control and manipulation. And now, he was here. His gaze flickered past Alexander and landed directly on her. "Ah, there she is," Liam drawled, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "The one who got away." Elena's breath hitched. Alexander's expression darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. Liam barely spared him a glance. "I'm someone from Elena's past," he said smoothly, "and I've come to collect what's mine." Alexander's entire body went still. Elena felt the air shift, felt the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She stepped forward, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm not yours, Liam," she said, her voice shaking. "Not anymore." He chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, you always did have a flair for dramatics." Alexander's jaw tightened. His patience was running out. "You have 5 seconds to get off my property," he said coldly. Liam tilted his head, amused. "Or what?" Alexander didn't blink. "You don't want to find out." The guards behind him took a step forward, their presence a silent warning. But Liam, he didn't seem fazed. If anything, he looked entertained. "Elena," he said, his voice turning softer, almost sweet. "You're playing house with a billionaire now, huh? That's cute." Her stomach churned. She wanted him gone. She wanted to pretend he had never existed. But she knew Liam, and he never let things go. "What do you want?" she whispered. Liam's smirk widened. "You." The word sent a shiver down her spine. Alexander took a step forward, his presence towering, overwhelming. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice like steel. Liam raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what are you? Her knight in shining armor?" Alexander didn't flinch. "Elena is under my protection now," he said firmly. "And if you think for 1 second that I'll let you lay a finger on her, you're dead wrong." A flicker of annoyance crossed Liam's face. For the first time, he seemed to realize that Alexander wasn't a man to be trifled with, and that made him dangerous. "Elena," Liam continued, ignoring Alexander, "do you really think you can just erase the past? Do you think you can run forever?" She stiffened. "I'm not running." "No?" He chuckled darkly. Then why are you hiding? Her hands trembled and Liam took a step closer, and that was it. Alexander moved so fast that Elena barely had time to process it. 1 second, Liam was standing there, smug and arrogant. The next, Alexander had grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. I told you to leave, Alexander snarled, his voice deadly. Liam's smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in, voice low. I know who you are, Mr. Billionaire, he murmured, and I know your weakness. Alexander's grip tightened. My weakness? Liam's eyes flicked toward Elena. Her! A heartbeat of silence, and then Alexander shoved him back. Liam stumbled slightly but caught himself, straightening his jacket as if nothing had happened. He exhaled sharply, then turned to Elena. This isn't over, he promised. Then he walked away, disappearing into the night. Elena stood frozen, her pulse hammering. She knew Liam. He never made empty threats. Alexander turned to her, his silver eyes burning. Elena, he said quietly, tell me the truth. She swallowed hard. But her voice broke, because deep down she knew the truth. Liam wasn't done with her, and now neither was Alexander. The next morning, Elena sat in the grand dining room, staring at her untouched plate of food. Her mind was spinning. She needed to leave. Liam had found her. That meant it was only a matter of time before things got worse. But how could she walk away now? Not when Noah needed her, and not when… Elena! She looked up. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. She took a shaky breath. She wasn't ready for this, but she nodded anyway. They walked in silence to his office. When the door closed behind them, Alexander turned to face her. I need you to be honest with me, he said, his voice calm but firm. She swallowed. About what? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. About him, about Liam. She hesitated, but she couldn't lie anymore, not to him, not after last night. So she told him everything. She told him about how she met Liam years ago, about how he had been charming at first, until he wasn't, about how he had controlled her, manipulated her, about how she had finally found the strength to leave, but Liam had never let go. He had searched for her, and now he had found her again. Alexander listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, she looked at him, her heart pounding. I understand if you want me to leave, she whispered. I don't want to bring danger to your home, to Noah. He stared at her, then, Elena, he murmured, stepping closer. She inhaled sharply. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. You're not leaving, he said quietly. Her breath caught. But I won't let him hurt you. His voice was low, firm. I won't let him anywhere near you. Tears burned in her eyes, and he meant it. She could see it in his gaze. She didn't know when it happened, didn't know when Alexander Hayes had become the one person she could trust, but he was, and for the first time in years, she felt safe, truly safe. She exhaled shakily, and then before she could stop herself, she whispered the words she had been too afraid to say. I don't want to leave. Alexander's eyes darkened. His fingers curled under her chin, tilting her face up. Then don't, he murmured. A beat of silence, and then he kissed her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. What would you do in Elena's situation? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for the next thrilling tale. The next thrilling tale. The next thrilling tale. The next